Okay, so you hear meditation thrown around all the time these days, don't you? Wellness blogs, maybe even your aunt keeps telling you to try it.
Ha! Yeah, it's definitely gone mainstream.
But I think beyond just like the buzzwords, there's something really deep here, a practice with, well, frankly, millennia of history behind it. And it's way broader than just, calming down for 5 minutes.
Absolutely. It's this huge spectrum.
Yeah.
And I think to really get what it means today, we kind of have to look back, right? Understand where it came from, how it evolved,
Mission is basically to build a solid foundation, understand the core ideas, trace that journey across different cultures, different times.
and map out the main types, the
Yep.
different flavors of meditation, if you like.
Right. Sort of get the essential toolkit ready. So when we look at specific aspects later, maybe the science or certain techniques, we've got that groundwork. We've looked at quite a range of stuff, old texts, new research.
And what jumps out immediately is, like you said, it's not one thing. It's this massive family of practices.
It really is a tapestry, isn't it?
It is. And what's really interesting is how all these different threads, they seem to connect back to these fundamental human things, seeking meaning, understanding ourselves, trying to feel okay, basically, across such different places and times.
Okay, let's start right there then. The word itself, meditation. What are we actually talking about? Where does that come from?
Well, the word we use in English, meditation, it actually comes from Latin, meditatio.
Hmm.
And originally it meant something more like to ponder, to contemplate, to think deeply about something.
Huh. So not necessarily sitting cross-legged in silence.
Not initially, no. And if you look historically across all sorts of traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism even, you find threads in early Christianity.
Yeah.
And Islam meditation was seen mainly as a spiritual path, a way to get deeper insight, maybe reach enlightenment, or just connect with something bigger.
So the goal wasn't primarily, say, stress reduction like we hear today.
Not the way we frame it now,
Yeah.
generally. But that's what's so fascinating, how incredibly adaptable it is. Today, while those spiritual roots are still super important for millions of people,
It's also become this secular tool, hasn't it?
exactly, it's widely used just for mental health, managing stress, improving well-being. It's kind of this interesting flip. A practice originally about transcending the self is now often used to manage the self better.
That secular angle definitely feels dominant in popular culture now. But you mentioned history. How far back are we actually talking? Give us a sense of the time scale.
Oh, we're talking ancient. There's archaeological evidence, things found in the Indus Valley civilization
Oh.
that's modern-day Pakistan and northwest India,
Cool.
dating back to somewhere between 5,000 and 3,500 BCE, so like 5,000 years ago or more. And these finds depict figures in poses that look remarkably like meditation postures.
Wow. That's incredible. So potentially people were doing this right at the dawn of civilization.
It really seems that way. It's quite profound to think about. Then, moving forward a bit, still in India, you have the Vedas. These are ancient Hindu scriptures, maybe around 1500 BCE,
Oh.
and they describe early forms of meditation, often called dhyana. The goal there was very much about spiritual liberation.
Okay.
Then, a really pivotal moment is the emergence of Buddhism around the 6th century BCE. This is where we see the development and refinement of really influential practices like Vipassana.
Vipassana, that's often called insight meditation.
That's right. It focuses on developing this really clear awareness of what's happening moment by moment. And also samatha, which is more about cultivating calm, focused tranquility.
And was this just happening in India, or were similar things developing elsewhere?
Great question. No, not isolated at all. Around the same time, maybe even earlier in some cases, you had stuff happening in China. Taoist traditions were developing practices like Qigong and Tai Chi.
Ah, the moving meditations.
Exactly. Systems that blend movement, breath, and mental focus, often aimed at balancing ki or vital energy. And then if you look towards the Middle East, within Islamic Sufism, you have practices like dhikr.
E-care.
Yeah, it often involves the rhythmic repetition of divine names or specific phrases, kind of focused devotional meditation. So you see these parallel streams emerging, different cultures exploring inner awareness and mental training.
It's amazing they developed independently, but with related goals. How did these practices start to travel to spread beyond their origins?
Well, think about ancient trade networks. The Silk Road, for instance, starting maybe 5th, 6th century BCE.
Okay, yeah.
That was huge. As Buddhism spread from India, traveling eastwards into China, then Korea, Japan, if meditation practices went with it. But for the West, real exposure was much later. The 19th century was a bit of a turning point.
How so?
There were events like the 1893 World Parliament of Religions in Chicago. That was quite significant. You had figures like Swami Vivekananda, who came and introduced Hindu philosophy, including meditation concepts, to a Western audience that was becoming quite curious about Eastern thought.
So the seeds were planted then, but it feels like the 20th century was when it really took off in the West.
Oh, absolutely. Huge shift.
Hmm.
You had people like Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who brought transcendental meditation, TM, to global attention. Very influential.
Right, TM became very popular, didn't it?
Hugely. And then later in the century, you have someone like John Kabat-Zinn. He developed mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR. He drew heavily on Buddhist mindfulness principles, but presented it in a completely secular scientific framework, specifically for stress and health. That was massive for making it acceptable, even integrated into healthcare settings.
Right, MBSR is really well known now. Okay, so we've got this incredibly long global history, and you mentioned the variety. Let's dive into that. What are some of the main types of meditation people practice today?
Definitely. This is where you see the real richness. Let's start with mindfulness meditation, since we just mentioned MBSR. Its roots are deep in Buddhism, particularly texts like the Satipatthana Sutta.
Okay.
The core idea, really, is paying attention to the present moment, your breath, sounds, thoughts, feelings, sensations, but doing it non-judgmentally, just observing what's there without getting swept away.
Kind of like being a neutral observer of your own experience.
That's a great way to put it. And the research on mindfulness is pretty extensive now. It shows benefits for reducing stress, anxiety, depression, even improving attention and how flexibly we think.
Makes sense. Okay, what else? You mentioned TM earlier.
Right. Transcendental meditation, developed by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, drawing on Vedic traditions from India. The technique itself is quite specific. You silently repeat a particular mantra, a word or sound given to you for about 15-20 minutes, usually twice a day.
A mantra. So like a focus point.
Essentially, yes. It's meant to allow the mind to settle down effortlessly. Studies on TM have suggested links to things like lower blood pressure, reduced stress, and maybe some cognitive benefits too.
Interesting. Different approach. What about Zen? We hear about Zen meditation.
Zazen, yeah. That comes from Zen Buddhism, which developed in China and really flourished in Japan. Zazen puts a strong emphasis on posture, sitting in a very specific, stable way.
Why the focus on posture?
It's seen as embodying alertness and presence. While sitting, the focus is often on the breath, just observing it, or sometimes on contemplating a koan.
A koan, like those riddle-like questions. What is the sound of one hand clapping?
Exactly like that. They're paradoxical statements or questions designed to challenge logical thinking and provoke a deeper, more intuitive insight. Zazen is often associated with developing sharp attention, managing stress, and better emotional regulation.
Okay. Feels quite disciplined. What about something maybe focused more on emotion?
Good point. That brings us to loving-kindness meditation, or metta, also from the Buddhist tradition.
Metta.
Here, the practice is actively cultivating feelings of warmth, kindness, and goodwill. You typically start by directing these feelings towards yourself. Phrases like, may I be happy, may I be healthy.
Right.
Then you gradually extend that outwards to loved ones, then to neutral people, then even to people you find difficult, and finally to all beings everywhere.
That sounds challenging, but powerful.
It can be. But the research suggests it's really effective at increasing positive emotions, boosting empathy and compassion, and it can even help with depression.
I can see how that would work. Okay, you also mentioned Vipassana earlier, the insight one.
Yes,
Yeah.
Vipassana. Again, a core Buddhist practice. It involves very careful, sustained observation of your direct experience, primarily the breath and bodily sensations. The aim is to see directly, through experience, the nature of things like impermanence, dissatisfaction, and non-self.
So less about cultivating a specific feeling, more about direct seeing.
Exactly. It's about developing wisdom through insight. And like mindfulness, it's linked to reduce stress and anxiety, better emotional balance, and increase well-being stemming from that deeper understanding.
Got it. What about yoga? People often talk about yoga and meditation together.
They are deeply connected, historically and practically. Yoga meditation obviously comes from the Hindu tradition. It's often a combination of physical postures, asanas, breath control techniques, pranayama, and seated meditation practices.
The whole package.
Pretty much. It's very holistic. Benefits are seen across the board: stress reduction, better cardiovascular health, improved mental clarity, that kind of mind-body integration.
Yeah, that integration seems key. Are there others we should touch on?
Maybe a couple more briefly. Chakra meditation, this comes from Hindu and Tantric traditions. It involves visualizing and focusing on the 7 main energy centers, or chakras, in the body. sometimes using affirmations or sounds to balance them.
Chakras, right, the energy centers.
Yeah. The scientific research here is more limited compared to mindfulness or TM, but practitioners use it for stress reduction and emotional balance, working with that subtle energy model.
Okay.
And then there's guided meditation. This isn't really tied to one ancient lineage. It's more a modern format.
Yeah.
You basically listen to a teacher or often a recording guiding you through a process. It might be visualization, relaxation, focusing on a goal.
Sounds very accessible, especially for beginners.
It really is. Often a great starting point. It's widely used for anxiety, sleep problems, general well-being. And beyond those, you also find mantra meditation more broadly, just repeating a sound or phrase. Progressive muscle relaxation, tensing and releasing muscles, and visualization techniques used in various contexts.
Wow. Okay. It really is a huge landscape. It definitely drives home that point. There's no single meditation. It's more like finding the right tool for the job or the right path for the person.
Absolutely. That diversity is probably a big reason why it's endured and spread so widely. There's likely a form that resonates with almost anyone's needs or temperament.
So we've heard about all these potential benefits: stress, focus, emotions. What does the actual science say? Has this stuff been studied rigorously?
Oh, definitely. Especially in the last, say, 20, 30 years, the scientific interest has exploded. A big part of that is down to advances in technology, especially brain imaging, like fMRI and EEG.
Right, the scanners that let us see brain activity.
Exactly. They allow researchers to actually observe what's happening in the brain during meditation, and also to see if there are longer-term changes in brain structure or function in people who meditate regularly.
And what are they finding?
Well, the findings are pretty compelling. Studies show that regular meditation can lead to measurable changes. We're talking about changes in brain regions involved in things like attention control, emotional regulation, and self-awareness.
So it's not just in the mind, it's physically changing the brain.
It appears so. For example, some studies show long-term meditators tend to have increased gray matter. That's like the processing centers in the prefrontal cortex. That's an area crucial for decision-making, emotional processing, complex thought.
Okay, that's significant.
And conversely, they sometimes see reduced activity or even reduced gray matter volume in the amygdala.
The amygdala, that's the brain's fear center, right? The stress response hub.
That's the one. So less reactivity, potentially. These structural and functional changes suggest meditation is having a real physical impact.
Fascinating. What about bigger picture studies looking across lots of research?
Yeah, meta-analyses, where they combine results from many studies, generally support the benefits. Mindfulness-based approaches consistently show good results for reducing stress, anxiety, and depression symptoms.
Okay.
Transcendental meditation studies often point towards benefits for blood pressure and reducing general anxiety levels. Loving kindness practice seems effective in boosting positive emotions and empathy. And across various types, there's evidence for improvements in cognitive functions like attention, memory, and executive functions, our ability to plan and organize.
So it seems like modern science is increasingly backing up what these traditions have claimed for centuries, in a way.
In many ways, yes. Science is starting to map out the mechanisms behind why these practices seem to work. It's providing a different kind of validation.
Now, as meditation has moved around the world, bumping into different cultures, have there been like adaptations or maybe friction points?
Oh, for sure. It's never just a simple transfer. When a practice lands in a new cultural environment, it naturally gets reshaped, reinterpreted. We already talked about the West often focusing on secular benefits like stress reduction in MBSR.
Right.
Compare that to, say, Zen practice in Japan or traditional yoga in India, where the spiritual goals, enlightenment, liberation, connecting to the divine, whatever the term, often remain absolutely central. It's the primary purpose.
So the why behind doing it can be really different.
Totally. And think about China, where practices like Qigong are often embedded in a whole system of health, longevity, and spiritual cultivation. It's very holistic.
Different emphasis again. Has this led to any issues, controversies?
Yeah, it has sparked some important discussions. One big one is around cultural appropriation, especially with Western secular adaptations of practices from Eastern spiritual traditions.
How so?
Well, the concern is that sometimes these practices get stripped of their original context, their philosophical roots, their ethical dimensions. They get repackaged, maybe simplified, and the deep cultural heritage can get lost or trivialized. Are we taking something sacred and turning it into just another self-help technique without respecting its origins?
That's a really valid point, a tough ethical question as things go global.
It is. And related to that is the commercialization. Meditation apps, fancy studios, wellness retreats.
Big business now.
Can be. And while that makes it more accessible for many, which is potentially good, the criticism is that it can also dilute the practices, turn them into consumer products, maybe promising quick fixes that aren't realistic. It risks losing the depth.
So it's a bit of a double-edged sword, wider reach, but potential for shallowness or distortion.
Exactly. It really highlights the need for us to engage thoughtfully, to understand the history, the context, the different intentions behind these practices, not just grab the technique that sounds easiest.
Being mindful about mindfulness itself, in a way.
Precisely. It encourages a deeper, more respectful engagement.
Okay, so as we wrap up this first foundational look at meditation, what's the main thing you hope people take away? The core understanding.
I think the biggest thing is just appreciating its sheer multifaceted nature. This isn't one simple thing. It's ancient, it's global, it's incredibly diverse in its forms and aims.
Right, from pondering to insight to loving kindness to balancing energy.
Exactly. And these diverse techniques have real potential benefits, which science is increasingly exploring and often validating. But alongside that, we need to be aware of how it changes as it travels. The ethical questions around adaptation, appropriation, commercialization, it's complex.
It really is. So this gives us that solid base, that framework for the topics we'll explore next in the series.
Hopefully, yeah.
So maybe for you listening, as you've heard about this long history, these different approaches from silent sitting to mantra repetition to cultivating kindness, maybe ask yourself, what sparks your curiosity? Which aspects resonate? What questions pop up for you? That's really the starting point for your own exploration, and definitely something to keep in mind as we continue these deep dives.